Today we have a crazy story of revenge on a company that wants to ruin Christmas. We'll get into that in a bit, but first, sometimes the best revenge is seeing karma play out. I used to work at a high-end restaurant in New York City, part of a large corporation with several chains. I worked there for about 3.5 years before they eventually fired me, but I'll get to that later. First, let me give you an idea of my role. My job was a mix of everything. From the day I started, I made it my mission to learn as much as I could. I was persistent with management whenever I wanted to learn a new department. I started as a server, but eventually moved into different roles, including carryout, hosting, bartending, bar backing, banquets, catering, and deliveries. My main goal while working there was to make myself available for as many hours as possible. I was earning about $12 an hour, though that varied when I worked as a bartender or server and made tips. Eventually, management noticed that I excelled in one of the non-tipped positions. I was so good at it that they decided to try me out as an unofficial supervisor over the team handling carryout, catering, and deliveries, as these were all part of the same department. I knew this would likely mean fewer hours, since I'd only be working in one department, so I negotiated with management for a pay raise of about $11.50 since I was taking on additional responsibilities. They agreed to the pay increase. I wasn't trying to make as much money as possible, I just wanted to cover my bills and still have a little left over for fun. Living in the highly taxed city of Chicago, in the already highly taxed state of Illinois, it made it tough to make ends meet and still have money to enjoy life. I'm someone who finds joy in simple pleasures, and I can stay entertained with things for long periods. A video game, for example, could keep me occupied for several months, sometimes even years. Things were going well until our general manager was replaced. The new GM, let's call him Tony, was known for his tough love approach, but a quick Google search revealed his darker side, a history of domestic abuse. It didn't take long for the rumors to start about his inappropriate behavior toward female staff. Soon after, Tony began replacing our managers with people he had worked with before, including a kitchen manager named Marco. Marco was a spineless lackey who would do anything to stay in Tony's good graces, even if it meant making our lives miserable. Despite all this, I kept my head down and focused on my work. My department had no official manager, so I continued to supervise, trying to keep things running smoothly. But it wasn't long before Tony and Marco started to see me as a threat. My coworkers suggested I be promoted to the official manager, but I could see the writing on the wall. Tony and Marco were determined to get rid of me. The first sign of trouble came when Tony and Marco began cutting hours for our department. They promised during a meeting that they would stop this practice, but within a week, they were back to their old tricks. One night, after a massive catering event, Marco tried to send everyone home early, leaving me alone to clean up. I confronted him, reminding him of the promises made, but he simply told me to stop complaining and hinted that I could easily be replaced. I knew then that they were setting me up for failure. That night, I stayed late to finish the cleanup, which meant I had to work overtime. The next day, I was written up for working overtime without approval. When I refused to sign the write-up, pointing out that I had no choice, the HR rep present, someone not yet under Tony's influence, allowed me to leave without signing. But I knew it was only a matter of time before they found another way to push me out. Then came the day of my firing. As usual, I arrived at work an hour early to grab some lunch before my shift. One of the line cooks offered me a dish that had been canceled, saying Marco had already comped it. It happened to be my favorite appetizer, so I accepted it gratefully, but as soon as I sat down to eat, Tony and Marco approached me, accusing me of theft. They claimed there was no record of the dish being canceled and told me to finish my meal and leave. I tried to explain, but they wouldn't listen. Knowing I had been set up, I decided to go down without a fight. For now. I gathered my things, said goodbye to my coworkers, and made one last stop at the accounting office to pick up any tips that had been left for me. On a hunch, I set my phone to record before entering the office. As I waited outside, I overheard Tony and Marco discussing how they had finally gotten rid of me. The recording wasn't clear, but it was enough to capture their voices admitting they had set me up. I knew I would need this evidence later. I knocked on the door and they hushed up before opening it. They asked what I was still doing there and I asked for my tips. They gathered what was in the safe for me and handed it over. Despite my anger rising at what I just heard, I decided not to burn this bridge just yet because perhaps I could nuke it later. I offered a handshake to both managers, thanked them for the opportunity to work there, and left, making sure to pull my phone out of my pocket and record the front of the restaurant with the sign showing its name and logo. It was necessary when working in a restaurant. You learn to always cover your own butt. It's true for most jobs, but something was just telling me I would need this all later. If I was being accused of theft, I wanted to be able to prove it wasn't true if it ever came up in future job interviews, which is exactly what happened, and where this all started going nuclear. On the way home, I sent some messages and made some posts on some local groups on Facebook saying that I had just been fired and that I was looking for a job as quickly as possible. By the time I got off at my stop, I had already set up an interview for later that day. I was offered the job about 5 minutes into the interview, but after going over the details, it didn't sound like it was for me, so I turned it down. I interviewed a few other places and found one that was a darn good fit with a hefty pay increase compared to my previous job, and I wouldn't have to deal with customers. It was an auditing job for a logistics company. The next day, I went for the callback, and during the interview, the manager, let's call him Dan, mentioned that he had already spoken to my former employer, Tony, who had accused me of theft. Fortunately, Dan gave me a chance to explain. I played him the recording, and when he recognized Tony's voice, he knew I was telling the truth. Dan hired me on the spot, and I sent him a copy of the recording for safekeeping. I thought that would be the end of it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to do more. Tony and Marco had wronged me, and they were going to pay for it. About 7 months later, I was well settled into my new job when the company sent out a welcome email for new hires. One name stood out: Tom, a former coworker from the restaurant. I sought him out and asked why he had left. It turned out he hadn't left voluntarily. He'd been laid off because the restaurant was under investigation. Apparently, corporate had received an email with a video attached, the recording I had made on the day I was fired. Corporate sent an auditor to investigate, and things quickly unraveled for Tony and Marco. They had tried to bribe the remaining staff in my department to lie about me, but when the auditor arrived, several employees quit on the spot and exposed the truth. Strike one for Tony and Marco. Strike two came when the auditor, Audrey, showed them the recording. They denied everything, but their voices were unmistakable. Audrey temporarily demoted Tony and transferred Marco to another location. This broke their alliance, and they started attacking each other on Facebook on a public post on the company page. The post has since been deleted, but this is what happened. Marco had been pictured in the Facebook post on the restaurant page, and Tony made a passive-aggressive comment about how Marco shouldn't even be in the picture since he'd been moved to another restaurant. Marco saw this comment and said something along the lines of, "At least when people Google my name, I don't show up as the guy that punched his wife," to which Tony responded, "Very funny from the guy who's cheating on his wife with Janet's sister." Janet's not her real name, but Janet was the girl they appointed to officially supervise my old department after they fired me. Marco replies to that by saying, "Like you haven't tried with half the waitresses. They all have stories about you trying to freak them." The post was deleted, but not before it had been seen by Audrey, the official auditor. Another strike came the next day when Audrey started interviewing the female waitstaff and bartenders, seeing if any of them could confirm that Tony had tried to make a move on them. All of them were interviewed separately. Several of them had similar stories. Every girl that confirmed Tony had made a move on them all said he had offered to be their sugar daddy if they would send photos or stay after closing to fool around with him. Tony was fired. But that wasn't the end of his troubles. Audrey wasn't just any auditor. She was the former regional manager who had hired Tony's wife as the general manager of another restaurant in the city. She called up Tony's wife and told her everything. His wife filed for divorce the next day, and the news of his firing spread quickly among their social circle. Tony's reputation was in tatters. As for Marco, his troubles were just beginning. It turned out that the restaurant he had been transferred to was in an area with a high immigrant population. Marco, who had always made off-color remarks about immigrants, quickly found himself at odds with the staff. One day during a routine inspection by immigration authorities, several employees were found to be undocumented. Marco was implicated in a scheme to exploit these workers, paying them under the table to avoid taxes and paperwork. This led to his arrest and the eventual closure of the restaurant. Marco was sentenced to prison for his role in the scheme, and several employees were deported as a result. In the end, Tony and Marco's downfall was swift and brutal. Tony lost his job, his marriage, and his reputation while Marco ended up in prison. As for me, I moved on to a better job with better pay and never looked back. But the satisfaction of knowing that justice had been served stayed with me. They had tried to destroy my life, but in the end, they were the ones who were destroyed. I didn't set out to ruin their lives, but when they pushed me into a corner, I fought back with everything I had. Sometimes the best revenge is simply letting people destroy themselves with their own actions. All it takes is a little nudge in the right direction. And that's how I turned my last shift at that restaurant into the ultimate act of revenge. Honestly, I think the most clutch thing here is that OP must be in a place where it's a one-party consent state. To even take that recording and be able to use it, you have to have the right to do so. Depending on where you live, especially in the United States, some states it's inadmissible because you have to have consent to have recorded that to begin with. But also, hi, I'm Steven, and if you guys enjoy crazy stories of revenge, it would be amazing if you left a like or left a review if you're listening to my podcast. That said, our next story is, I made sure I got back at my irresponsible younger brother. My younger brother is the most self-absorbed, laziest guy I have ever met, and this is me putting it nicely. He has zero respect for me, and he doesn't care about anyone else's needs but himself. I used to think his exes were full of it until he came over to live with me. I made the mistake of agreeing to accommodate my youngest brother, the last born, me being the first out of 3 children, to be more specific. I have 2 junior brothers and I'm the only girl. This was back in 2020 when I had no idea a pandemic was going to occur. My parents, who happened to be my brother's advocate, decided to speak for him and said it was just going to be for a few weeks at most. I wasn't against him coming over to stay at my place. What I was against was the fact that he could have gone to stay with John, my immediate junior brother. John was also a man, like my youngest brother Peter, and had his own place, but my parents' excuse was that it would be an inconvenience to John's wife and a whole bunch of story that made no sense. I told him that if it was just for a few weeks, I'm sure his wife would have no problem with her brother-in-law coming to stay with them a few weeks, but that wasn't enough to convince them. Nothing I said convinced them. I eventually got tired of arguing with my parents and told them he was welcome to stay at my place on the condition that he behaves himself. I knew Pete was quite the brat back when I still lived at home with my parents, but that was 4 years ago. I expected some level of maturity from a 24-year-old guy. Honestly, if I was to blame anyone, it would be my parents who decided to spoil him so much way back from when we were kids. They were too lenient and accepting of some of his wrong behavior and always said he would change when he grows up. According to my parents, he was coming over to stay because he had an important interview. I couldn't say no to that, not when it was something as important as a job. Pete comes over to stay, and by the end of the week, I was going crazy. I'm a banker, so I tend to go to work earlier than when Pete wakes up, and that wasn't a problem. He had the spare room to himself, and I was fine with that. What I wasn't cool with was the state I always met the house with after work. The house was always a dump. He never cleared his plate after eating, he would order food and wouldn't bother packing up the leftovers, and worst of all, he was always sitting in front of the TV playing a game or watching a show while expecting me to make dinner for him. I'm pretty sure he sometimes forgets to shower because sometimes he stinks. I try to be gentle and not controlling whenever I corrected him or expressed my displeasure in the state of the house, but it all fell on deaf ears. I couldn't wait for him to go back home after his interview. In fact, I was so tired I started counting down towards the day of his interview. Then COVID came and the lockdown was implemented, and I was stuck with him. I asked about his interview, and his response was that he was going to be an online interview. The upside was that if he got the job, he could stand on his own 2 feet and be independent. I had no idea I was being delusional. I was forced to spend 4 excruciating months with Pete, and we spent most of it bickering. He mostly made reference to me being a stuck-up witch, while I made it clear I would not tolerate his disgusting behavior in my home. Of course, he had the nerve to talk back. I couldn't send him back to my parents' house, and while all of this was happening, I was solely responsible for his feeding and paying all the bills. He was broke and the job was his means to get his life back on track, but that also did not work out in his favor. What I was told by him was that he wasn't accepted. I tried to convince him there were several options still available. He could learn an online skill during the lockdown and try to make the most out of it, and for a moment there I thought I'd gotten through to him because my younger brother comes to tell me he had found something he was interested in taking, but he needed to pay to take the course. I listened to him as he explained how he could benefit a lot from learning about Python and gave him the money. I learned a few weeks later the money had gone into game ammunition. I wasn't even surprised at this point. I was just angry. I spoke to my parents and they kept saying they would talk to him. I didn't need them to talk to him, I wanted him out of my house. The rest of the months were the same. I had to tolerate his habits and put up with his condescending attitude until lockdown was over. Then I helped him with his luggage and drove for hours to take him back home, and I really thought that was the end of it. I spent the last 2 years enjoying having my space to myself and not having to train a grown man on how to behave himself until one weekend my parents showed up with Pete claiming he was depressed because his girlfriend recently broke up with him and needed a change of environment. They were scared he was going to do something horrible to himself and thought he would get himself together at my place. I was determined not to fold this time. I wasn't a therapist and I had a job, so I couldn't keep my eyes on him the way they could, but I was told the girl who broke his heart was a new neighbor who lives down the street, and he finds it hard for him to be in the same environment as her. I folded again and decided to accept him back into my home, and a week became a month. This time it was me coming to my apartment not only to meet the house in a disorganized state, but also women I had never met before in my house. I couldn't deal. I left my apartment for a couple of weeks to stay at my boyfriend's place, which was an even worse idea because that just gave him the freedom to do as he pleased. I decided I was done taking his crap and went back to my apartment, giving him 2 options. He either gets a job and maintains it for a year and I help him out by renting his own place when I see how serious and dedicated he was, or he stays jobless at my place and I make his life a living heck. I think that was the wake-up call he needed. I had never seen him so determined to get a job. He kept calling friends and applying for any job application that came his way. I had no idea he could be that desperate for something. But then again, rent in the city was no joke. And if I was being honest, I couldn't afford to get him an apartment alone, so I discussed with my parents and John. John had no problems pitching in. After all, there was enough time to save up for his share, but my parents weren't into the idea. They thought it was a bad idea to let Pete live on his own. By now, I was smart enough to understand their logic. Bringing Peter to my place was their way of taking off his responsibility from their hands. If it hadn't been a girl that broke his heart, it would have been something else they would have used as an excuse just to bring him over. I understood where they were coming from. Someone as irresponsible as Peter needed to face real life rather than hiding under the shelter of his parents. But if they think I'm going to continue accommodating him in my house for the rest of my life, they have another thing coming. I didn't care about what they thought was best for Peter right now. All I cared about was them pitching their share of the money, and when the time was right, he was getting his own apartment. Pete eventually landed a job as a delivery man. I was so happy he finally had a job that required his attention. Everything was going fine. I knew he wasn't getting paid a lot, so I just never asked my brother to contribute to anything, but I expected a little modesty from him. Just getting a few items needed at home would have been enough to show he cared, but my brother couldn't do that. I once asked him where his money was going into, and he said he was saving up for something. I assumed he was trying to save up for an apartment so he could drop his own share at the end of the year, while I do my part by dropping the money we gathered together for him. But turns out I was being delusional. On this very day, out of the blue, my brother requested for my car. This was something I never allowed and made clear to him from the onset, but he and his friends were going out and they needed a ride. I decided to make an exception because he was doing well for himself and was finally having a social life instead of staying inside and playing games all day. I regretted doing this because the state I met my car the next day in was crazy. The bumper had been dented and the headlight was broken. It was obvious the car had crashed into something and I was mad. I told Peter he was fixing the car and he had the nerve to tell me he was sorry, but that wasn't going to be possible. I didn't talk too much. I used the money that was supposed to be for his apartment to get my car fixed and gave him what was left of it, saying he was free to do what he likes. My younger brother went ahead to get himself a car. Not just any car, but a brand new unused car. Now I was shocked because he'd been working as a waiter for almost a year, and I knew the money he got wasn't enough to get him a car, especially a brand new car. I expected him to be smart enough to try and get a place for himself, but I don't think my brother had any intention of doing that. I asked him where he got the money from, and he said he was still in the process of paying for it. I also asked him why he couldn't have gotten something more affordable, but according to him, it wasn't his style, and he wanted something that was worth driving to the outside world. I had always known my brother was irresponsible, but I at least thought he was smart to some extent. But he proved me wrong that day. My brother was an idiot. On the bright side, he had something that meant a lot to him. I begged him to let me take it for a test drive, and after a lot of pleading, he agreed. I made sure to bash his car the same way he destroyed my car. Honestly, I didn't even do half as much as he did to my car, but the look on his face when he saw the state of his car was worth it. He wept. I saw him on his knees crying, and I didn't feel any remorse. He should have known better than to mess with me in the first place. Everyone kept saying I went too far, but with what he made me go through, that was the tip of the iceberg. He packed up his things and left the house without saying a word to me, quit his job, and went to stay with John, which once again proved my point that he was an idiot. John ended up paying the rest of the money for the car and accommodated Peter for 3 months before sending him back to our parents because his wife couldn't cope with Peter. Considering who Peter is and what actions Peter does, I'm not surprised that the parents are trying to pawn him off on whatever sibling is foolish enough to accept him again. I mean, I imagine they would be willing to manufacture whatever problem it is to excuse why they couldn't keep him around and why John wouldn't be better for them. And I mean, to be fair, they were right. John's wife couldn't deal with him. I don't think most people can. Our next story is, there's no way I'd let the company get away with ruining my Christmas. My name is Martins, and I'm the father of a 7-year-old, and I like to give him everything I could in my power. It wasn't really easy growing up the way I did. There was barely enough, and the little my dad got, he wasted it all away on alcohol and gambling. Very cliche, I know, but that was the story of my life. I practically had no joy during the festive periods while my mates were getting new toys. I was hoping my dad didn't sell the roof on our heads. So when I got older and I had a choice to marry and have kids, I had just one dream. I would see my children have the best I could give them. That's why this revenge story is one I always like to share. It happened during a Christmas period when my son had just turned 7. Christmas, like every other festive period, came like every other year, with its pressure on me to make it a special one for my family. As a father, nothing mattered more to me than seeing my son's face light up with joy on Christmas morning. But with both my wife and me on a fixed income, every cent counted. We'd had to make some tough decisions, cutting back on a few things, but I was determined not to let my son feel the pinch. This year, I knew exactly what would make his Christmas unforgettable: a football rebounder. After weeks of searching, I found the perfect rebounder on a well-known retail chain's Irish website. The price was right and the site was reputable, so I didn't hesitate. I placed the order, imagining the hours of fun my son would have with it. When the confirmation email came through, I felt a wave of relief. One more gift secured, and all without breaking the bank. It felt like a small victory in the constant battle to stretch our budget while keeping the magic of Christmas alive for our son. With the rebounder ordered, I could finally relax. We were getting the house ready for Christmas, decorating the tree, wrapping presents, and making sure everything was perfect. The sense of satisfaction that came with knowing my son's main gift was sorted was immense. I pictured him waking up on Christmas morning, tearing open the wrapping paper and running outside to play with his new toy. For once, it felt like everything was falling into place, and I allowed myself to believe that this Christmas would be one to remember, for all the right reasons. As I had earlier said, we try to cut costs as much as we can in my family, so it came to me as a lot of shock when just a few days after placing the order, while I was wrapping some last-minute gifts, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was from the courier company. Something about customs charges due on a delivery? My heart sank as I read the message. Customs charges? This couldn't be right. We hadn't ordered anything from outside the country, or at least I didn't think we had. My first thought was that it had to be a scam. After all, we'd been so careful with our purchases, especially this close to Christmas. But the more I thought about it, the more it nagged at me. I decided to dig deeper just to be sure. After a bit of detective work, it hit me like a ton of bricks. The customs charge was for the football rebounder, the gift I'd carefully selected to make my son's Christmas special. They had shipped it from the UK, and now we were stuck with a €50 customs charge. My initial shock quickly turned to frustration. €50 might not seem like a lot to some, but for us, it was a serious blow, especially when every penny was already accounted for. I felt cheated. How could a company sneak in such a charge without any warning? This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a violation of trust. At a time when I should have been focused on making my family's Christmas perfect, I was now dealing with a financial burden I hadn't planned for. I had no plans to pay that huge charge and what I hadn't already budgeted for. So the next day, I tackled the issue head on. I picked up the phone and dialed the customer service number of the retail chain. Having worked in customer service myself years ago, I knew what it was like on the other side of the line. I reminded myself to stay calm, polite, and patient. All I wanted was for them to refund the €50 that we were unfairly charged. It seemed like a simple enough request, given the circumstances. When I finally got through to a representative, I explained the situation clearly, outlining how the customs charge had come out of nowhere and was not mentioned during the purchase. The rep listened and promised to escalate the issue, assuring me that a manager would call me back soon. Feeling somewhat reassured, I hung up the phone, hopeful that this would all be resolved quickly. But the promised callback never came. By the end of the day, I found myself anxiously checking my phone, waiting for a call that didn't happen. The next morning, I called again, determined to get this sorted. This time, I was put on hold for what felt like an eternity. When I finally spoke to another rep, I was given the same runaround. Another promise that a manager would call me back. Frustration began to creep in, but I kept my cool. Surely this couldn't be so difficult to resolve. By the third day, however, my patience was wearing thin. I had called multiple times and each time I was stuck on hold for longer and longer. No matter how polite or understanding I was, my complaint seemed to be going nowhere. Each promise of a callback felt like an empty gesture, a way to get me off the phone and out of their hair. The realization hit me hard. This company wasn't taking me seriously. My simple request for a refund was being ignored, and the sense of injustice I felt was growing by the minute. After about 4 days of repeatedly calling throughout the whole day, I finally got through to a customer service representative who, instead of offering a solution, presented me with an insult. The rep, in a tone that was more dismissive than helpful, offered me a €20 voucher as compensation for the €50 customs charge. My initial reaction was disbelief. A voucher? Not even enough to cover half of what I was unfairly charged, and only usable on their website, which I had no intention of using again. The rep was indifferent to the situation, but tried to help, and what he said sent me over the edge. He said, "We advise our customers that there may be DDU charges, delivery duty unpaid, i.e. customs charges, on any item that gets shipped outside of the UK. Then I asked him where it states this information, and he paused, and then he said he didn't actually know. I took a deep breath and forced myself to stay calm. "Well, I know one thing," I said, my voice steady but firm. "It doesn't say it anywhere on this transaction because I've checked. And because this is a violation of my consumer rights, I'm going to give your company one last chance to make this right. Have your manager call me within the next 60 minutes, or I'm going to post this entire debacle on LinkedIn and link every senior officer in your company." Then I hung up the phone and waited, and of course, no call came. The next morning, I woke up determined. I'd given them their chance, and they blew it. So I opened my laptop and logged into LinkedIn. I wasn't just going to complain, I was going to make noise. I crafted a post that detailed everything: the hidden customs charges, the ignored requests for a manager, and the ridiculous €20 voucher offer. I didn't hold back. This was about more than just getting my money back. This was about exposing their shady practices. I tagged everyone I could find connected to the company: regional managers, European directors, even the CEO. If they thought they could ignore me, they were about to learn otherwise. I hit post, and it felt like the first punch in what was now an all-out war. Not long after, I noticed something strange. The item in question, the football rebounder, had been taken down from their website. It was as if they thought they could just erase the problem and pretend it never existed. But they clearly underestimated me. A simple search for rebounder still brought up the item, just without the page still attached to it. So I took screenshots of everything: the empty page, the Google cached version from 2 days earlier that still showed the item, all of it. I went back to my LinkedIn post and added a comment. "Looks like they're trying to hide the evidence now, but the internet doesn't forget. Here's what they don't want you to see." I uploaded the screenshots and tagged all those senior officers again, making sure everyone knew what was going on. It wasn't just about the money anymore, it was about principle. The post started gaining traction. The response was almost immediate. Within hours, my post started gaining traction with likes, comments, and shares multiplying by the minute. People began to rally behind me, sharing their own horror stories about dealing with the same company. The support was overwhelming, and it wasn't just customers who took notice. At one point, I noticed that 3 people had viewed my profile in incognito mode. I could only guess who they were, and the thought made me smile. Naturally, I took a screenshot of that too and added another comment, trolling them for their incompetence and lack of transparency. The next morning, my phone rang. The number was from the UK. I answered, and on the other end was a senior executive from the company. Her tone was entirely different from the customer service reps I'd dealt with before. She was practically groveling, apologizing profusely and asking what she could do to make things right. I could hear the desperation in her voice, but I wasn't going to let them off easy. I originally wanted my 50 euros back, I began, since it wasn't fair, nor even legal, that I had to pay it. But now, after everything I've had to go through just to get your attention, I want my 50 euros back, a full refund on my entire purchase, and I want to keep the product. That's the only way this is going away. There was a pause on the other end of the line. I could almost hear her calculating the cost of my demands against the potential PR disaster. After a moment, she agreed to everything I asked for. She asked for my PayPal address, and within an hour, the 50 euros was refunded, the full purchase amount was credited back to my account, and she confirmed we could keep the rebounder. It was exactly what I had demanded, and I could tell from her tone that she was just relieved it was over. I thanked her, but deep down, I knew this was more than just a victory for me. It was a win for every customer who had ever been brushed off by a big corporation. I wasn't about to let anyone walk all over my family, especially not some multi-million-pound company. They tried to take advantage of us, but I stood my ground, and in the end, we won. My son would have his gift, and his view of Christmas remained untarnished. The satisfaction of knowing I had protected my family was worth far more than the money. This victory was ours. Legitimately, I do think if normal customer support is not helping you resolve the issue in any kind of reasonable way, the next best thing you can try is trying to find the contacts of some higher up in the company that maybe actually does care about how well their company is doing. Just don't go around trying to contact me and telling me to read these stories better. I'm already trying my best. But with that being said, that's all the time we have for today. Now, if you want to hear another absolutely crazy revenge story, check out that video on the left. Or if you missed my latest video, check out that video on the right. That said, I'll see you all next time with some more stories.